Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Dupas, Chief Operating Officer at Tabs Analytics. Welcome to the second annual Tabs Analytics Baby Products webinar. We'll be covering important consumer, channel, and product trends across 5 baby segments, covering 28 product types, such as bottles, car seats, baby formula, diapers, etc. Our next webinar will be the 10th annual vitamin study, scheduled for July 12th. Be sure to join us for this informative presentation that has been a bellwether study for the VMS industry. Please check back at our website at tabsanalytics.com in early June for the vitamin study webinar sign-up. Presenting today is Dr. Kurt Jetta, CEO and founder of Tabs Analytics. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions that you can submit via the chat box on your GoToWebinar screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jetta.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you to all of those of you who've attended, and particularly for the repeat attendees from last year. So this is the second year we've done the baby webinar, and what really makes this conducive to a webinar is that so much of the sales are in non-track channels. So in some categories in grocery, it's very easy to see what's being sold, because most of it's going through brick and mortar food retail or Walmart. But here you have Toys R Us and Babies R Us, you have e-commerce, you have a lot of other specialty retailers that are important. One thing that you'll see, I have a note up at the top here about past webinars. You can go to our website at that domain right there and listen to last year's baby webinar as well as all of the other past webinars we've done. And there are also, you'll hear me throughout this presentation today refer to prior things that we've either proven or discussed, so I don't spend your time kind of building out all the things that premises that I'm making. A lot of times I'll just refer you to a back webinar where that is talked about in more detail. So the methodology to do this is similar to all our other industry studies. It's consumer survey-based online survey. This is by Toluna. We beef up the sample size here because it is such a narrow core target of young families. So we do 2,000 adults, 18 plus. We've done it each of the last 2 years in April. I'm going to talk about the sampling in a bit more detail, but what we've done is we take all the responses from the last 2 years, so that's 4,000, and we're weighting those responses by the blended average of age, gender, and income, and I'll talk about why in a minute. The areas of questioning, we talk about purchasing across 9 consumer sectors overall, and they're sectors that are primarily have a very high importance in category killer type retail. So bookstores and sporting goods and pet and those types of categories and sectors. Then within baby, we ask about 5 segments, arguably 6, because we ask about food and formula together, and then we split it up when we talk about channel. But it's safety, it's baby feeding, it's diapers, baby needs, baby food, and baby formula. We ask where they buy their products for each of these segments, and we'll get the specific banners in specialty. We won't get it for food. We'll get it Target, Walmart, and then we also look at aggregated purchasing, mass market versus specialty versus online. And then we'll spend some time looking at crosstabs by the key demographics, which are income and households with young kids, which we're defining as 0 to 5 years old. In particular in this one, but we do it for all our surveys, we spend a lot of time corroborating the data we get through the survey with external sources. And because if this doesn't align with other more reliable data sources we know to be true, then you really can't place a whole lot of validity. So because of the sampling aberrations from last year, we really went overboard, I think, this year, and I'll kind of point that out. And so what happened last year is on the sample, in general, we know that in surveys you're underrepresenting certain groups, and so it's easy to weight those, and mothers with kids, if it's not important to the particular sector, that kind of adjusts on its own. last year's data, we oversampled those households, a lot of it because we were concerned we wouldn't get enough of them. So we basically got twice the number of households with young kids last year as we did this year. And this year's percentage is within 1 point of the national average. So we took the blended weighting of age, gender, and income, and we did not just wait for households and with young kids, because what we found is we got unsatisfactory results on some of the other sectors. So what we would expect is, so now we have something that balances to the national representation on age, gender, and income, but it doesn't balance as much. It's still a bit overstated on households with young kids, and we'll kind of point out how you would think about making some adjustments there. But what I can say is I have a very high level of confidence on the directional results of this study. So if I'm saying something is down, it is down. It may not be down to the magnitude that we're saying, but in the research, but it's not going to be up, or it's not going to be flat. And there's because what we found is just we don't have the data that can corroborate the magnitude of some of these declines. There's also this interesting shift when there's a meaningful shift in behavior, and we've seen it in a lot of other studies. If you go back to the webinar, you'll see I kind of pointed out periodically that survey seems to accentuate meaningful shifts in consumer behavior. So if something, suddenly shifted, say 10%, the survey is going to call it out to me 30, sometimes 40%. So that's something, I can't quite explain why. We've asked a lot of experts in the field, but it's an interesting little dynamic of surveys. So let's talk about sector penetration, because we want to benchmark baby versus some of these other categories, and this is actually how we can also understand that kind of the overall validity of the research is solid. So what we see is that after the weighting, you can see by across these categories what percent of adults purchase, and you see there's not a lot of movement in most of these sectors. You see some declines in, say, jewelry, sporting goods, which we know to be true as far as from other data sources, and you see this real big drop for baby products. In fact, over 30%. So that's kind of this big outlier there versus all these other sectors. So we see declines, and these declines are consistent, again, corroborating external sources. We know, for example, sporting goods is under real pressure. There's been a lot of bankruptcies in Sports Authority and some regional areas. Jewelry, if you Google, the jewelry sector, again, some weakness. A lot of people moving to e-books. So, these trends are aligning with other things we know to be true. What we also then would say is the decline in baby isn't 32%, but it's pretty big. We're projecting it would be about 10 to 15%. And so there's this really meaningful, concerning drop that this research calls out in baby products, and then we can look at that on, for certain demographics. So here's all the incidents by demographic group, and the thing that we find that's really interesting is that the only meaningful demographic group where there's increases is high income individuals. So about a quarter of the buyers in the sector are high income, and you can see the incidence. How dramatically it goes up by income. And then this is versus last year, so 13 versus 19% last year. So we can see really across the board some pretty significant drops. You see a little increase on the 75 plus. That's not statistically significant. And also, this is interesting as well that I'll show you, is that the majority of buyers, not the volume, but the buyers are actually households don't have young kids in the household. And notice how that decline, down 25%, is much higher than the households with kids. So it suggests there's this high discretionary component that's affecting the sales. But if you've seen kind of the teasers and the tweets that we sent out about this webinar, talk about how baby is a microcosm of the geo-economic political world order. And that's not that is not that crazy of a premise. What we see in all developed countries is this really strong shift in income. So high income people are growing their income, everybody else is flat, and we see kind of more of these discretionary purchasing going down. Is it going down in the 30s? Again, no, it's not that big, but it is meaningful and significant. And again, based on this split, that kind of supports that discretionary component as one of the big drivers of why baby would be trending down. And so that's that component right there. And we see this income skew across every single sector that we looked at. We looked at 9 of them. And in every single one, high income earners had higher purchasing than low income than those below. And we're talking big samples here. So remember, we do 2,000 people each year. And so the percent that are at the 150 plus, I mean, we're talking, you know, in the sample 250 to 300 based on the year. Excuse me. And with, you know, it's the exception versus the rule that we see higher incidence this year versus last year. Look at baby, though, the extreme difference as we get higher in income. So we start at the low of under 25. Still in the 13 to 14% range. It climbs up noticeably and then dramatically at that 150 plus. The blue line is the overall average last year. The orange is the average this year. So we get that really big disparity, and it's a 3-to-1 disparity, 4-to-1 disparity actually. Now, if you recall, if any of you sat in on personal care last month, and even some of our consumables, some of the other sectors, we actually see CPG purchasing peak around the 75K mark, the heavy buying, and then it actually dips slightly. So we see this lower marginal propensity to consume with income for CPG, but not some other these bigger ticket, more discretionary type of categories where it swings heavily toward the higher income. And this decline in baby we're seeing across all the segments. They're all in the 30% range. So the diapering, so it went from 25 to 17. Formula and food combined went from 18 down to 12. And again, we're estimating the actual decline is 10 to 15%. And that's across all outlets. So you may say, well, my Nielsen or my IRI isn't showing that type of decline. And actually, as we get the channel, a lot of the declines are really based more, not entirely, but more skewed toward the specialty area. So we'd have a lot of data now on product by type, and we can also slice this by demographic segment, which I'm not going to present here, but of course we can always have follow-up conversations if there's areas of interest. But the interesting thing as we look at diapers, feeding, and the 2 others that I'll show on the other page is you have this, really there's not a big spread. Once you're in the category, you're buying a lot, and there's not that big of a disparity on the number of types of products purchased, whether you have young kids or you don't. So there's this real incentive to get people into the category, because once they're in, a very high percentage of them buy a lot of different stuff. So this is what the way we read this, average type purchased within diapers. So, you know, it's basically summing up all these percentages and dividing by 100 for those that are actually overall purchasing in the category. So, I'm sorry, not by 100, by the people that are overall in the category itself. So you can see that there's a lot of different things being purchased. Overall, as a percent of the population, yeah, fairly small numbers, not inconsequential, but I mean, we're at 10% or below. But as we saw in the prior page, the overall penetration from our survey is 22% for baby overall, and then any given segment within there was in the 12 to 18% range. And then safety is even a higher number of purchasing than the other 2 we just looked at. And why that's important is safety tends to be the much higher average purchase dollars per purchase, transaction sizes and price points. So there's a really particularly high incentive to get people into the category and incentivize them and give them, once they're in, give them incentives to buy even more on that particular purchase occasion. So where are people buying these particular products? And we'll look at each segment. I won't go into excruciating detail on each one, but I'll point out some of the highlights. So what we're looking at is the share of the overall transactions, and this is one where I'll refer you to prior webinars where we've kind of built the case that there's a high correlation between share of mentions and share of transactions. So when I say share of mentions, this is a market share, but it's just share of transactions, not of dollars. But you can see online is a very big percentage of baby, and it was last year, it continues to be this year, and those of you that kind of seen other webinars know that I'm a big skeptic on the ongoing viability or potential of online overall, particularly grocery, where the share is below 2%. Here, a very big part of the sales are being done online, and then you can see by each individual banner. And look at how big Walmart and Target are relative to Amazon. I mean, you don't see that type of competitive tightness in any of the other sectors that we've looked at. We can also then look at the change in share. And so this is, again, where we talk about internal validity. So if there's some really major problems with the data or how we're weighting the data, you'd expect all kinds of goofy swings in trend for these. But they're remarkably similar year over year, so that when you do see changes, they truly are meaningful. And again, trying to corroborate external data sources. I mean, been a lot in the press about weakness and problems with Babies R Us and Toys R Us, and you can see in diapering they've definitely lost some share. Sears, of course, have had their pretty significant problems. Bye Bye Baby is another specialty outlet. So the common theme across most of these segments will be declines in specialty. Here's an example, though, of online gaining share, significant share, but their sales are still down, and that kind of always been, the lazy man's approach now is, oh, everything's shifting online. Well, there is a share shift, but that's not the big reason for the weakness in retail, because actually from our study, online purchasing is actually down a bit as well, just not as much as the other channels. So there's something much bigger at play than just switching to online. One of the big things I already reviewed is that income effect, how purchasing growth rates or income growth rates are flat for everyone except the very high income. And so that tends to have a depressing effect on the overall retail environment. And then there's also this general structural shift in consumer preference. So, I'm sure every one of you knows that you're spending a lot more on electronics and iPhones and apps and all those types of things than you were, say, 5 years ago. So there's this kind of overall shift toward those types of products, and a lot of other sectors are kind of feeling the pain. Apparel is feeling the pain. So a lot of the specialty channels feeling the pain. So just kind of, again, to support the fact that online has a little bit of a reason why brick and mortar retail is weak, but if you had to rank the order of importance, it's probably third behind the income effect and the shift in consumer preference. Baby feeding, so we're talking cups, bowls, pacifiers. We're also talking bigger ticket products like breast pumps and bottle kits. Excuse me. So online is a bigger presence here. Here, really important is specialty is down big time here. Lost 6 points year over year. And this has always been one of those categories where kind of consumers are buying a lot of different stuff. If you recall that chart that I showed earlier on, there were a lot of different types that make up the feeding environment. So when you're losing share there, I mean, that's a lot of transactions, pretty meaningful number of trips that you're losing. So that has some kind of probably even outweighed important strategic element of being down in this particular segment. Online gaining share as well here. Here's one thing, and this is the exception versus the rule. Now, Target made this a signature category, baby overall, and really only 1 out of the 6 segments we looked at that Target picked up share. Now, they offset their declines a bit by gains in Target.com, but not all the way. So it would appear that their efforts really didn't have the payoff I think they would expect it, and you can see from a macro basis, all that focus on signature categories certainly hasn't translated into, major same-store sales growth. In fact, they're declining. As we look at safety, this is the most highly developed segment for online, 26%, which is kind of a close second to mass. And then specialty down at 19%, and again declining pretty significantly. Baby needs, online tends to be a bit smaller. Mass market tends to be a bigger area. I mean, we're talking baby lotion, diaper cream, baby shampoo, those types of things. One thing we do see is that the discount food, and unlike any of the others where there was growth, but I mean this is a pretty big swing here for discount food, which is primarily Aldi, but would also be a thing, places like Save-A-Lot or something like that. Now as we look at the food sectors, formula and food, we see the other mass market, which is traditional food channel, being pretty significant. These are their best outlets, but we also see gains in specialty, and this has always been, formula has always been an area that they've perceived to be a traffic driver, so they always have given a disproportionate amount of effort. To the extent that they've done that in the last year, it seems to at least have paid off, because that's the only segment where specialty actually picked up sales. And then baby food, again, very mass market oriented, less specialty, less online. So how does that roll up as far as relative strength by segment, by channel? So you can see, first of all, that they're all pretty close. So within mass market, the range is fairly narrow, so it gets 31% share as a low and 34% as a high. If we look at other mass market, which is food, club, dollar store, drug, you can see it's a low of safety, which big ticket items, but it could also be the outlet plugs and those types of things, and relative strength, a comparative advantage for formula and food, where its share is the highest. Online, the relatively low in the higher purchase frequency categories, higher for formula. If those of you that that saw last year's webinar, I basically created a framework to help predict how big a category's potential would be in online, and it was a function of transaction size and purchase frequency. And so the more frequently products are purchased, the lower the share will be in online. But that would be offset if it's frequently purchased but bigger ticket, you would expect the share to be higher, and that certainly diapers fits into that framework. Very high frequency on diapers, but it tends to be bigger ticket, and therefore getting a higher share online than these other lower price categories. And then specialty, as I mentioned, formula is doing very well, or relatively speaking, in that channel. And so kind of made all these comments here, and so as you get the deck, you'll be able to kind of highlight and associate where the relative strengths are for all those. And then we also asked, so for whom are you buying the product? And that I kind of always get back to, and from all the experience I've had in baby, and I've had over 20 years of, just it would always bother me that we didn't focused entirely on young moms. And here it's only less than 60% of the people are buying for their, have kids at home. A big percentage of the people are buying for others. Mostly it's close friends and relatives, but just understand that, I mean, there is a broader target out there than just young moms. Now, is that the most efficient? No question. Based on our estimate, there people with young kids at home, they're 42% of the buyers, but 80% of the volume. So, I mean, they are a big part of the volume, but there's still a meaningful part that don't have young kids. So what can we conclude about this category? First of all, this purchasing, the income effect, we really see as a kind of a microcosm of major shifts we see at retail, politics, and the economy. All this kind of shift toward populism that we see in the U.S., the UK, looks to be in France. It really is that whole bifurcation of the population that we're seeing, is that when there's not kind of a consistent growth across most of the income sectors, that tends to lead to disruption and unrest. Someone in this sector needs to find out why there's such an extreme income skew. I mean, 3 to 1, I don't know, 4 to 1 between high and low. I don't know if I've ever seen a category that skewed. I mean, that's, something I would expect in luxury cars, but not baby products. And there's a high discretionary income element to it, but not entirely. And diapers and food don't seem to be particularly discretionary in any event. Baby isn't down 32%. The buyer count isn't down 32% as would be suggested in the survey, but it is down a lot. And our best estimate is about 10 to 15% of the sales have been lost. So last year we estimated the sector is about $30 billion. So you're talking about down 3 to 4.5 billion. So it's a big chop in the sector. And the lazy man's version of weaknesses in retail is, it's just all shifting to e-commerce. There was one, company I was talking to. They, well, $1 billion is done online. I mean, it's all changed. And, we were talking about a $2 billion category. It's like, no, the actual number was probably 50 million or something like that. So, but it was just so easy. And there's just this natural propensity of people to overestimate the channels and the products that you can't actually measure. So you always think they're bigger than they actually are. And certainly e-com would be a part of that. I mean, certainly some of those sales have shifted to online, but online is still down as well. How do we know? Well, we know that Amazon shut down diapers.com, and I should have focused on it on the prior pages, but they actually picked up share in just about every segment. I mean, they are focused on baby. They seem to have a meaningful share of the overall market. They were growing, and thus that still wasn't good enough for Amazon. They shut it down. In fact, I would say that kind of the fact that it was shut down just really raises, at least in my mind, because I've been an online e-commerce skeptic anyway, just about the ongoing viability in many consumer sectors, because I thought, based on all the research we've done, because vitamins and cosmetics are two, where we see e-commerce for specialized type of products tend to do on a market share basis pretty well. I thought that's how it would converge. You'd have Amazon and all these specialists. But if they can't make money, if diapers.com could not make money, then who can? Certainly Target's focus on baby as a signature category didn't seem to play out all that well, as they lost share in 5 or 6 segments that we tracked. They did have some nice gains in Target.com, and last year I said baby was the front line of the of success in online grocery or online e-commerce for consumer, and certainly Walmart and Target seem to have made some nice gains in their e-commerce for this sector share-wise. Once somebody buys in the category, they spend a lot of, they tend to buy a lot of other stuff in a very short period of time. So kind of think about that as a way that shoppers behave, and then structure actions around that. Households with kids aren't the only target. They're 58% of the buyers, 20% of the transactions, and only 6 in 10 people purchase this category for their own kids. So what can be done? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, expand the marketing communication behind just exclusively young mothers. There is a rationale for getting a message out to a broader audience. Second of all, invest in research to understand the low penetration among lower income. I should have actually mentioned here also just understand because that is the big driver why the category is down, but also just further insight as to where this category is heading and why we are seeing such substantial declines. There's a basis for providing really compelling financial incentives for consumers once they are in the market to buy. And I'm not talking buy one, get 50% off, because that typically doesn't have much of an impact. But it's really something e-commerce is uniquely qualified to address. So once, say, a baby product gets into their basket, I mean, there is a very strong rationale to post a really compelling offer to say, hey, if you buy this next one, I mean, we're going to take the whole basket, every item, we're going to take a ton of money off. to get that basket in this category in particular loaded up. So it's not just kind of the people in this, that bought this also bought this. There's always that when you go into Amazon in particular. I'm talking really strong financial incentives for people to get load up in this category because they're not buying all that frequently. And so it's really a load up strategy when they do buy. If you're a manufacturer, you need to consider how much you want to invest in the specialty channel. The prospects there are not good. I mean, I would expect you'd probably get a whole lot bigger shakedowns in the last year than you have before, and a lot of those guys were always famous for their shakedowns. But just like all the other category killer areas, or most of them, they're going to face some real challenges. Toys R Us, Babies R Us, we've been reading about it in the industry press, and that would be projected to continue. And then promotions in general is an easy way to get those discretionary purchases from non-parents. So remember, that was a big disproportionate area. The drop was from non-parents because of the discretionary nature. How can I get them to buy then? And make it more financially compelling, and promotions are the way to do that. So that is the summary of the baby industry for 2017. Thanks for everybody for attending, and I'm going to toss it back to Dustin for questions.